The cafeteria at Mercy General smells like industrial beef broth and floor wax. Katie Morrison carries her tray with both hands, steady grip, nothing casual, and scans for an empty corner table. The fluorescent lights above buzz their constant metallic hymn, and she keeps her eyes down because looking up means making contact, and contact means conversation, and conversation means explaining why a floor nurse moves like she's still clearing rooms in Ramadi. She finds her spot. Third table from the window. Back to the wall, view of the doors. Muscle memory. She doesn't realize she's doing it anymore. The thermos of coffee sits beside her untouched salad. She brought it from home, from the apartment she rents in Ocean Beach that still feels like borrowed space, because the cafeteria coffee tastes like burnt diesel and the sound of the espresso machine triggers something in her chest that makes her hands shake for 47 minutes afterward. Sirens do worse. The ambulance bay doors do worse still. But she manages. She always manages. Katie is 28 but looks older. The kind of old that doesn't come from years, but from things. Her hands have the particular calluses of someone who spent 18 years gripping tools that were never metaphorical. Her eyes are the color of a stormy Atlantic, but they don't look at people directly anymore. It's a choice. A safety measure. She learned in her second deployment that meeting someone's gaze means they expect you to be human. Easier not to be. She wears scrubs from the hospital gift shop, navy blue, anonymous, the color of every other nurse on the pediatric wing. Her hair is pulled back so tight it looks painful. It's not. Pain was information, and information was useful, and useful meant staying functional. That's all she needs to be. Functional. The sandwich tastes like nothing. Dr. Marcus Hargrove observes her from across the cafeteria for exactly 9 seconds before looking away. He's noted the tremor in her hands when she'd handed him a patient chart this morning. He's noted how she stands slightly back from the nurse's station, never quite inhabiting the space she's supposed to occupy. He's noted that she speaks in single sentences, vital stable, doctor, lab results pending, and never elaborates. Never explains. Never makes eye contact. Weakness. He's good at seeing weakness. It's his primary skill, though he'd never frame it that way. He'd frame it as observation. Clinical assessment. The ability to recognize when someone doesn't belong in an institution as prestigious as Mercy General. There are 462 registered nurses in this hospital. This one moves like an apology. What he doesn't see, and this is the particular blindness of men like him, is that her hands shake because they've held things he can't imagine. Her eyes don't meet his because she's looking past him, through him, at a door 3,000 miles away in a base housing unit where an IED killed a woman named Sarah Morrison. Her silence isn't submission. It's the deliberate, weaponized restraint of someone who learned that words are dangerous, and quiet is survival. He doesn't see the scar tissue on her left shoulder, barely visible below her scrub collar. A 7.62 mm round that entered at an angle. She was 23 years old. She kept working anyway. Kept saving the Marines around her. Kept moving until the mission was complete and the last helicopter was wheels up. None of this shows on her face. She finishes her salad. Throws away the tray. Doesn't spill a drop. The pediatric wing smells different. Cleaner. There's a quality to it that reminds her of trying not to remember things. The hallways are painted a shade of blue that some consultant in Manhattan convinced the hospital would be calming for children. The paint smells like fresh chemicals and broken promises. At the nurse's station, Katie picks up her chart queue for the afternoon shift. 3 post-ops. 2 admissions. 1 consult. The consult is Dylan Morrison. Age 6. Admitted 12 hours ago via emergency services. Presenting with behavioral disturbances, persistent mutism, and elevated cortisol markers. Father present and cooperative. Mother deceased. Listed as priority psych evil, though the initial attending physician had written in neat clinical handwriting, likely trauma response. Recommend sedation pending psychiatry. Katie reads the chart twice. The second time, she pulls the full intake notes. Sergeant Major Morrison had been off duty when the IED detonated outside the family's base housing unit in a suburb north of Camp Lejeune. His wife, Sarah, age 31, had been inside with Dylan. She'd been inside when the blast wave hit the reinforced windows like a sledgehammer. The structural engineers report noted that the family lived exactly 2.3 miles from where the device was placed. The distance was irrelevant. The outcome wasn't. Dylan had seen his mother killed. The medical examiner's findings were sealed in a file Katie wasn't technically supposed to access, but the pediatric discharge notes made clear that the boy had been standing in the kitchen when the shockwave came through. He'd watched. 6 years old, and he'd watched his mother die, and then he'd closed his mouth and hadn't opened it in 18 months. Not at the hospital where they tested his hearing and found nothing wrong. Not at the Naval Base Hospital in Portsmouth where the psychiatrists admitted they couldn't find anything medically causing the mutism. Not for his father, who sits beside his hospital bed with the particular exhaustion of someone who's learned that love isn't enough to fix what's broken. Katie closes the chart. Her hands are steady. She goes to find Dylan's room. The boy is asleep when she arrives, his small frame barely making an impression under a hospital blanket decorated with cartoon submarines. Sergeant Major Morrison is in the uncomfortable chair beside the bed, the kind that folds out into something that isn't quite a bed and isn't quite anything useful. He's dressed in a polo shirt and jeans, his hair military short, his posture the kind of rigid that comes from 24 years of making sure his spine never forgets who's in charge. He looks up when Katie enters. His eyes are red-rimmed but clear. The eyes of someone who's learned that falling apart isn't an option. "I'm Katie Morrison. Floor nurse," she says. No elaboration. No explanation. The words are small and precise, like she's handling something fragile. "I'm going to be handling his vitals through the evening shift." "Thank you," the sergeant major says. His voice is exactly what she'd expected, steady, command-trained, the kind of voice that's used to being obeyed. "Has the psychiatrist been in yet?" "Not yet. Orders show evaluation pending, pediatric consult tomorrow morning. They keep wanting to sedate him." The sergeant major glances back at his son. "The attending physician suggested it again this morning. Said it might help him sleep, help with the anxiety." Katie's jaw tightens. She's good at hiding reactions, but the sergeant major catches something in the way her shoulders shift. Something protective. Something that doesn't fit with the profile of a nurse who exists to follow orders. 6-year-old should be sleeping naturally, Katie says. 8 words. She'd never explain why sedation for trauma is a band-aid on a severed artery, never explain that the boy's nervous system is already running on fumes and adding chemicals to that particular fire would just lock him deeper into the part of his brain that's learned the world isn't safe. Never explain any of that because explaining would mean admitting she knows things she's not supposed to know. The sergeant major studies her for a moment. Something in his bearing shifts. Just barely. Like he's hearing something beneath the surface that most people miss. "What would you recommend?" he asks. Katie doesn't answer immediately. She moves to Dylan's bedside and checks the monitor, heart rate 86, blood pressure 92/58, oxygen saturation 97%. She makes notes in the chart with a kind of careful attention that suggests she's writing more than just numbers. "Time," she says finally. "Consistency. Someone he recognizes. Your voice. Your presence. That's what the nervous system needs to feel safe again." The sergeant major doesn't ask her how she knows that. He just nods, like something's been confirmed that he suspected all along. Katie finishes her assessment and turns to leave. It's not until she's at the door that the boy's eyes flutter open. He doesn't cry. He doesn't make a sound. He just looks at her, really looks at her, with the particular intensity of a child who's learned to read the world in silence. She pauses. Meets his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then nods, once, the kind of gesture that means "I see you." Then leaves. At shift change, Katie returns to her locker in the staff room. The door is narrow. The locker is standard issue, blue metal, combination lock, the kind of confined space that feels like breathing room compared to other places she's been. She opens it slowly. The boots are there, resting on the middle shelf beside a spare set of scrubs and a bottle of ibuprofen she never takes. They're weathered. The leather is cracked in places where it shouldn't be. The soles are worn down on the heels from years of walking on certain kinds of ground, desert floors, metal floors of Black Hawks, tile corridors of field hospitals where the light never turned off and the sounds of ventilators and alarms and crying Marines became the soundtrack of everything. The boots are from 2008. She'd worn them for 7 tours. She'd worn them on the day she'd extracted a corporal from a burning Humvee in Ramadi while rounds came through the windows like wasps. She'd worn them on the day the IED had detonated near her position and the shrapnel had found her shoulder, and she'd kept moving anyway because moving was the only thing that made sense. She can't throw them away. She opens the locker every shift and looks at them, and every shift she thinks about throwing them away, and every shift she closes the door and leaves them there. The boots are a thing that belong to someone else. Someone named Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, Navy 01987-01, decorated for Valor, citation available upon request. Someone who'd made it through 18 years without breaking. That someone doesn't exist anymore. That someone is being replaced, slowly, by a woman who wears scrubs and trembles at sirens and can't find a reason to keep living that doesn't sound like a rehearsed answer in a therapist's office. But the boots are still there. And every shift, she almost reaches for them. She closes the locker without touching them and walks back to the pediatric ward. Dylan's light is still on. Sergeant Major Morrison is still awake, sitting in the uncomfortable chair, reading something on his phone. Katie does her 8 p.m. assessment, vitals stable, sleep patterns disrupted, cortisol markers still elevated, and makes a note in the chart that the boy has responded to verbal cues, which is technically true, even if all he'd done was open his eyes and look at her like he was trying to speak through pure concentrated intention. She doesn't mention that to anyone. What she doesn't know, and this is where the story moves into territory that will reshape everything she thinks she is that Sergeant Major Morrison had served as a corporal in Ramadi. That he'd been in a burning Humvee when someone pulled him out. That he'd never gotten that person's name, just seen them from the corner of his eye before the smoke took over and the morphine took over and the next 3 years took over. He studies Katie Morrison's face as she checks Dylan's and something about the way her hands move, precise, practiced, the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from a nursing school, makes him wonder if the woman pulling equipment from her pocket isn't exactly who she claims to be. But he says nothing. Not yet. Not until he has something more than intuition. Katie finishes her rounds at 9:41 p.m. The ward is quiet. The fluorescent lights buzz their eternal hymn. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeps with the steady rhythm of a child sleeping, finally, without the assistance of chemicals. She walks past Dylan's room one more time. The boy is sleeping. His father has his hand on the mattress beside his son's, close enough that if Dylan moves, he'll know. That's all either of them needs. To know someone's there. Katie understands that in a way that hurts to acknowledge. To know someone's there. Katie understands that in a way that hurts to acknowledge. She moves through Mercy General's corridors the next morning like a woman walking through water, present, functional, but operating at half depth. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with that particular frequency that reminds her of something she doesn't want to remember. She avoids the upper floors where Hargrove conducts rounds, stays close to pediatrics, checks on Dylan before her shift officially begins. The boy sits in his hospital bed in a shaft of pale San Diego sunlight, staring at nothing. His small hands are perfectly still on the blanket. Katie has started leaving picture books on his nightstand, not pushing, just leaving them there like breadcrumbs for someone who might want to follow a trail back to speaking. This morning she notices his copy of Where the Wild Things Are has been moved. Someone has been looking at it. The margin of that small shift fills her with something close to hope. At 10:44 a.m., the nurses' station erupts into controlled chaos. Dr. Hargrove arrives for rounds, surrounded by 3 residents in their short white coats and 2 attending physicians who seem to follow him the way planets follow the sun. His presence makes the air pressure change. His tall, expensively dressed, the kind of surgeon who has never had to second-guess his authority because the hospital's power structure has always bent in his direction. Katie watches from across the station, filing charts with meticulous precision, keeping her head down. Hargrove pulls Dylan's chart from the rack with one smooth motion. He opens it, scans the notes, and his jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Katie has documented everything: Dylan's breathing patterns, his heart rate variability, the subtle neurological responses she's observed that don't match simple behavioral trauma. She's written it all in clinical language, letting the data speak. She shouldn't have done that. She knows she shouldn't have done that the moment she sees his eyes move across her notes. He looks up. Makes eye contact across the entire nurse's station. Morrison. A word. Katie stands. The 6 other nurses at the station find sudden urgent business elsewhere: charting, phone calls, sudden needs to check on patients. The charge nurse, Barbara, pretends to be very absorbed in the computer screen. It's the sound that gets to Katie first, the squeak of Hargrove's expensive Italian shoes on the tile floor as he walks toward her. 3 squeaks. 4. Then he stops, close enough that she can smell his cologne, something sharp and aggressively botanical, the olfactory equivalent of a power suit. "I noticed you've been reviewing my patient's imaging." Katie keeps her hand steady. "I reviewed the imaging in the chart, sir. It's available to all nursing staff." "You're not nursing staff reviewing imaging." His voice stays level, conversational even. The residents lean in slightly, not wanting to miss this. "You're a floor nurse making diagnostic recommendations." To the attending surgeon. In writing. In the patient's permanent medical record. Katie takes one measured breath. Dylan's pattern doesn't match sedation-responsive trauma. The imaging shows. "I'm aware of what the imaging shows, Nurse Morrison. I also have a medical degree from Northwestern. 3 years of surgical residency. 15 years in pediatric trauma. So when you come to me suggesting that a 6-year-old who witnessed his mother's death might need neurology instead of pharmaceutical management, I'm going to assume you have either extraordinary medical training or extraordinary arrogance." The station has gone completely quiet. 2 nurses pretend to chart. One hangs back near the supply closet. Hargrove smiles. It's the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that says he's enjoying this. "Which is it?" Katie's voice comes out steady. "The boy needs a neurological consult. Write it in the chart and let the doctors practice medicine." Hargrove turns to the residents, the performance beginning in earnest now. This is what happens when nursing loses institutional clarity about scope of practice. Everyone thinks they can see what the specialists see. This nurse thinks she's a neurologist. Tomorrow someone else will think they're a cardiologist. The hospital becomes a democracy of incompetence. The residents laugh on cue. Katie files the charts, each one placed with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory developed over 20 years of moving through hierarchies, of knowing exactly where to stand and how small to make herself. She doesn't flinch. Doesn't feel the humiliation because she's learned to wall off that particular nerve. But something else is happening beneath the surface, a calculation, a cataloging. She recognizes this dynamic because she's seen it before in different uniforms, in different rooms. This is a man who needs everyone below him to stay exactly where he's positioned them. Hargrove moves toward the break room with his entourage. Katie returns to Dylan's room and sits in the corner chair, the one that faces the door, the one that gives her a tactical view of the hallway. The boy doesn't acknowledge her presence, but his heart monitor shows a slight change in rhythm, a tiny recognition that she's there. It's something. The cafeteria at noon is packed with the lunch rush, physicians, residents, nurses, techs, administrative staff. The kind of crowded where you have to navigate around bodies, where a single moment of inattention can change everything. Katie sits at a corner table, her tray in front of her, turkey sandwich, small container of soup, an apple. She's methodical about eating. Fuel. Nothing more. Hargrove walks past her table at 12:23 p.m. His elbow catches her tray with the kind of precision that no accident could achieve. The soup container flips first, tomato red spreading across the table like a sudden crime scene. The sandwich follows. The apple rolls. The plastic tray clatters against the floor with a sound like a dropped gun. Katie watches it happen with the kind of slow-motion clarity that comes from trauma training, her eyes registering every frame, her brain processing the mechanics while her body doesn't move. The room goes dead silent. Every conversation stops simultaneously, as if the universe has paused to watch this moment. Hargrove stops, looks down at the mess on the floor, then at Katie. He doesn't apologize. He smiles. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice carries to every table. Carries to the 2 residents standing near the beverage station. Carries to the attending cardiologist waiting in line. Katie kneels without speaking, controlled movements, no jerking or desperate scrambling. She gathers the pieces of her lunch with hands that don't shake. Not because she's not experiencing fear or humiliation, but because she learned long ago that the body listens when the mind gives clear orders. A single tear escapes from her left eye. She wipes it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Doesn't look away. Doesn't blink. The gesture is small but complete, acknowledgement of the moment without surrender to it. The boy needs a neurological consult, not another sedative. Her voice is quiet. It reaches maybe 4 tables. But Hargrove hears it. She sees the flicker cross his face, a micro-expression of something that might be surprise, might be anger, might be something more dangerous, recognition that his performance didn't land the way he'd planned. Katie finishes cleaning the floor, walks to the trash bin, disposes of the remains of her lunch, and leaves the cafeteria. Her hands start to shake as soon as she's through the doors, but that's private. That's her own. That afternoon, at 3:17 p.m., Hargrove stands at the main nurse's station with patient charts stacked in his arms. The entire shift has gathered for afternoon rounds, nurses, residents, the charge nurse, the unit director. He makes direct eye contact with Katie, who's standing 20 feet away, charting on the computer. Then he drops the charts. All of them. Patient records scatter across the floor like confetti, pages fanning out in slow motion, some sliding under the desk, some landing face up with names and medical histories exposed to the entire room. It's a deliberate gesture, executed with perfect timing. He lets the last chart fall from his hand and looks at the charge nurse. Since Nurse Morrison has so much free time to play doctor, perhaps she can organize these. Then, louder, into the space where everyone can hear, "I give her a week before she quits. Actually, let's make it interesting. $50 says she's gone by Friday." One of the residents laughs. Another one looks uncomfortable. Barbara, the charge nurse, opens her mouth to say something. Katie can see her gathering the words, but then decides better of it. Self-preservation. Institutional politics. The gravity well that Hargrove creates when he has allies in the power structure. Katie walks to the scattered charts without being asked. She kneels, always kneeling for this man, always in the position of supplication, and begins to organize them by patient number. Her hands move with the precision of someone who has learned to transform humiliation into fuel, to convert the heat of shame into simple mechanical action. She doesn't cry here. Doesn't allow herself that. But something else is happening, something deeper. With each chart she gathers, with each patient name she reads, each medical history she organizes, she's building something. A record. Evidence. Documentation. The same way she was trained to do in the field: observe, catalog, communicate only what's necessary, and let the data speak when the moment comes. She finishes at 3:41 p.m. 36 patient charts organized and filed. Perfect order. Perfect documentation. Perfect silence. That night she sits in her car in the parking lot of Mercy General, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The sky above San Diego is fading from blue to purple to the particular shade of darkness that comes just before true night. She can still see her combat boots from here if she leans forward. They're visible through the window of her locker, inside the hospital, waiting for her tomorrow morning. Waiting to see what happens next. But that wasn't the worst part. The double shift started the third day after the cafeteria incident, when Katie volunteered for the pediatric ward's overnight rotation. 16 hours straight, sometimes 18. Mercy General didn't question it, the hospital was short-staffed, and Katie didn't complain. She moved through the corridors like a ghost who had learned to be useful, timing her route through the children's unit to avoid the attending physician's schedule entirely. Dr. Hargrove worked days. Katie worked the gaps between his shifts. Dylan Morrison watched her movements with the intensity of a child who had learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. His father sat in a vinyl chair beside the bed most afternoons, a man whose uniform jacket hung over the back like a shed skin. Sergeant Major Thomas Morrison carried the weight of command even in a hospital room, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes tracking every person who entered his son's space. But when Katie moved past, checking the four-line, adjusting the pillows, speaking to Dylan in that voice like warm water, never loud, never demanding, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "Hey, buddy," Katie said on the night shift when Dylan's monitor showed agitation, his heart rate climbing toward 120. "Your O2 is fine. Your heart's just working hard. That's what hearts do when we're worried." She didn't touch him without warning. Didn't rush. She sat on the edge of the mattress with the patience of someone who had held dying men and knew that rushing only made the fear worse. "Want to know a secret? When my heart gets scared, I count backward from 10. Want to try?" Dylan's eyes, dark, ancient, carrying trauma no 6-year-old should carry, locked onto hers. He nodded once. 10, Katie said quietly. 9. 8. Her voice dropped an octave with each number, steady as a metronome, steady as the hands that had once performed field triage in Ramadi under fire. 7. 6. The monitor climbed down. 118. 115. 110. By 6, Dylan's breathing had deepened, his shoulders loose against the pillows. Katie finished the count and stood to leave, but the boy's small hand reached out, caught the fabric of her scrub sleeve. Held it. She stood there for 2 full minutes without moving, allowing the child this small anchor. The sergeant major watched from the doorway. When had he arrived, his expression unreadable. But his eyes tracked her the way a sniper tracks a target, with complete, undivided attention. After Katie left the room, she heard him move closer to his son. "What did she say to you, buddy?" Dylan didn't speak. But his small hand remained unclenched, open, peaceful. That was the first time Katie realized that the sergeant major was beginning to see something beneath the floor nurse's uniform. Something familiar in the way she moved. Something he recognized. The crash came on a Wednesday afternoon, Katie's day off, which meant she was driving back to the small apartment she rented in Ocean Beach when her phone buzzed with a message from a nurse she'd befriended. *code blue pediatric. Morrison case. They're asking for all hands. *. She was back at Mercy General in 7 minutes. The routine exam had started normally enough. Dr. Hargrove stood at Dylan's bedside with his stethoscope, performing what should have been a simple post-lunch assessment. The boy was improving. His vitals had stabilized. Another 48 hours and he might be cleared for discharge, for the long road of speech therapy and trauma counseling that was going to require years, maybe decades, to undo what one morning in a base housing unit had destroyed. Then Dylan's heart rate began to plummet. 120. 110. 100. Katie watched from the hallway where she'd stopped, backpack still slung over one shoulder, and saw the numbers drop like a stone into dark water. 95. 88. 80. Dr. Hargrove reached for his stethoscope. 3 seconds. That's how long he froze, not moving, not reacting, his fingers still reaching for the chest piece while Dylan's oxygen saturation began its own descent. 97. 94. 91. Katie was already moving before her conscious mind caught up. The backpack hit the floor. Her feet found the linoleum in a rhythm that felt like muscle memory activated, like her body was a weapon system and her brain had just issued a command it couldn't take back. 85. 82. Cardiac tamponade. The muffled heart sound she'd heard yesterday during rounds. The distended neck veins she'd documented in his chart. The narrowing pulse pressure that Dr. Hargrove had dismissed as post-trauma stress response. The pericardium was filling with fluid. The boy's heart was being crushed inside its own sac. "He needs pericardiocentesis now or he dies," Katie said. Not a question. Not a request. The voice that came out wasn't the voice of a floor nurse, it was the voice of a senior chief who had issued orders in the dark with rounds coming in from 3 directions and exactly 60 seconds to make decisions that meant the difference between extraction and body bags. "You do not give orders in my room," Dr. Hargrove snapped, his hand finally moving, reaching for the call button with the speed of a man who had just realized he'd missed something critical. But Katie was already positioning Dylan on his side, already calling for the crash cart in that same flat command voice that made the neighboring nurses move without question. The pediatric attending surgeon burst through the doors running. Mercy General's page system had broadcast code blue, and stopped in the doorway, freezing as he watched Katie's hands work. 14-gauge angiocath. The site prepared with antiseptic that smelled sharp as gunpowder, acrid, chemical. Her hands positioned the needle with the precision of a surgeon performing an operation under magnification, angle exact, depth calculated for a child's smaller anatomy, the understanding that 1 millimeter too deep meant puncturing the heart itself. Fluid aspirated. The needle moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this procedure under far worse conditions than a clean San Diego hospital room. She pulled back on the syringe. Dark fluid, blood-tinged, serosanguineous, filled the chamber. Dylan's oxygen climbed. 93. 96. 98. 100. The heart rate rose from 78 to 84 to 95, climbing back toward normal as the pressure released, as the boy's heart could finally beat without that crushing weight. Silence filled the room like a held breath. The attending surgeon stared at Katie's hands as if they performed magic, as if those hands couldn't possibly belong to a floor nurse. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Where did you?" His voice cracked. He started again. "Who trained you?" Katie's whole body had begun to tremble, not fear, something else entirely, the trembling of someone who had just performed exactly the action she'd been trying to avoid for 3 years, who had just revealed in 5 seconds of crisis what she'd been hiding in 63 days of careful invisibility. Her face was white, bloodless, the color of someone who had just watched their own careful construction collapse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I overstepped." She stepped back from the bed before anyone could ask her again, before anyone could see the recognition that was beginning to dawn in the surgeon's eyes, before Dr. Hargrove could recover enough to realize that something catastrophic had just happened to his narrative about this timid floor nurse. Katie turned and walked out of the room with the same measured pace she used for everything, and that was when the sergeant major followed her into the hallway. He moved like a man who had trained for decades to move quietly, boots on tile making almost no sound, presence somehow preceding him down the corridor like a pressure change before a storm. Katie didn't turn around. She kept walking toward the stairwell, toward any exit, toward anywhere that wasn't in front of witnesses. "What's your call sign?" His voice was low, pitched for her ears only, the voice of a man who already knew the answer. Katie didn't stop walking. "I don't know what you mean." But she did. And the sergeant major knew she did. She could feel his attention like weapon-grade focus, the same focus she'd felt yesterday when she'd sat at his son's bedside and counted backward from 10 while another parent's child learned to breathe again. The attending surgeon froze. His name was Dr. Chen, and he had performed 1,500 cardiac procedures in his career, but he had never seen a floor nurse move like this. The needle went in at the 4th intercostal space with the precision of a weapon being aimed. Katie's hands moved on their own, muscle memory overriding the trembling that had defined her for 2 years. The syringe drew back. Fluid. Dark fluid that had been crushing Dylan's heart. 30 milliliters. 40. The pressure released like air escaping from a balloon, and the monitor that had been screaming flatline began to sing again. Beep! 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 O2 climbing. 68. 74. 82. Stable. Her voice didn't waver when she spoke. Get the pericardial kit. We need to drain the rest. Dr. Chen stared at her. Not at the equipment in her hands. At her face. At the woman who had been pushing a med cart an hour ago, deferential and quiet, now commanding the room with the authority of someone who had done this in field hospitals under fire. The sergeant major stood in the doorway, Dylan's small hand still gripped in his, and Katie felt his attention shift. Weapon-grade focus. Recognition dawning like sunrise. She didn't acknowledge him. She worked. Moved Dr. Chen out of her way with a single gesture. You're blocking my light, Doctor. Not a request. A statement. By the time the cardiologist arrived, Dylan's heart rate had stabilized at 94. His blood pressure had climbed from non-existent to functional. The child breathed on his own, and Katie Morrison, the timid floor nurse in her worn scrubs, had performed a procedure that only emergency physicians and trauma surgeons should know how to execute. She stepped back. Let the cardiologist take over. Pulled off her gloves with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Dr. Chen watched her walk out without saying another word. The sergeant major followed. But that wasn't the worst part. Katie didn't know that Dr. Hargrove had been standing in the observation window of Trauma Bay 3. Didn't know that he had seen everything. Hadn't seen a nurse perform an emergency pericardiocentesis in 12 years of watching residents and attendings attempt the procedure. Had seen her hand steady as a surgical laser. Had heard her give orders to a physician with 20 years of experience as if he were an intern on his first day. Dr. Hargrove's entire institutional power depended on hierarchy staying intact. On everyone understanding their place. On nurses staying in their lane, pushing carts and following orders, never thinking they could step into the arena where real medicine happened. This woman had just crossed a line that threatened everything he had built. She had shown competence that couldn't be explained by a floor position. She had moved like someone trained, someone experienced, someone who had held lives in her hands before. He made the first call at 6:44 p.m. His brother-in-law, Marcus Sterling, sat on Mercy General's hospital board. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. I need to escalate a personnel issue. One of our nurses. Potentially dangerous. Marcus listened. Asked 3 questions. By the end of the call, Dr. Hargrove had described Katie as a liability, unpredictable, operating outside her scope, possibly falsifying credentials. I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning, Marcus said. The phone line went dead. The second call went to Portland, Oregon, to the nursing director at Legacy Emanuel Medical Center where Katie had worked 5 years earlier. Dr. Hargrove's voice carried the weight of professional concern. I'm conducting a reference check on a recent hire. Katie Morrison. She's been exhibiting some concerning behaviors. I wanted to verify her employment history and any disciplinary actions. The director remembered Katie, remembered her slightly, the way people remember someone who kept her head down and her hours quiet. She pulled the file. 5 years without a single incident. Excellent evaluations. But there was a gap. Katie had left suddenly in 2019, cited personal reasons, never applied for a reference letter. To Dr. Hargrove, a gap was a weapon. To the director in Portland, it was just a nurse who had moved on. She gave him the dates and said nothing that would hurt, but Dr. Hargrove didn't need her to. He had his timeline. He had his narrative. She quit her last job suddenly. No explanation. No references. Red flag. By 8:15 p.m., he had hired an investigator, a woman named Carol Dutchamp who specialized in credential audits for hospital compliance departments. Carol had never met Katie Morrison. Carol had no stake in Mercy General's internal politics. She would be, on paper, completely objective. That was the entire point. She would do what she was hired to do, find irregularities. And if the irregularities didn't exist, she would find room to question them. By midnight, Carol had requested Katie's military records from the Department of Defense, a request that would take 6 to 8 weeks through official channels, but Dr. Hargrove had already explained that time was of the essence. What happened in the 48 hours after Dylan's pericardiocentesis felt less like an investigation and more like an execution. Dr. Hargrove created a backdated timeline in Katie's personnel file, inserting performance complaints dated over the previous 4 months. Sloppy charting on March 14th. A missed medication on April 2nd. A patient complaint about rudeness on May 8th. None of it real. All of it documented. The fabrication was artful because it was small enough to seem plausible, scattered enough to suggest a pattern, vague enough to be difficult to disprove. Katie had kept her head down for 2 years. She hadn't kept detailed personal records of every shift she had worked. She couldn't definitively prove she was on a different floor on March 14th. She couldn't produce notes that would contradict his claims. He had built a structure of lies that looked like institutional fact. At 7:38 a.m. on the third day, Katie's phone rang. The hospital's human resources director, a woman named Janet whose voice carried professional regret. "Katie, we need you to come to a meeting. This morning. Don't come in for your shift." The words didn't register immediately. Katie was sitting in her apartment in Pacific Beach, still in her scrubs from the night before, her hand still steady but her mind beginning its familiar descent into the static that came when her body understood her mind didn't want to survive what was coming. Not a request. A command. The structure of the sentence meant suspension. It meant investigation. It meant the thing she had been terrified of since she arrived at Mercy General was finally happening. The HR office occupied the second floor of the administrative building, 3 corridors away from patient care. Katie walked there at 9:12 a.m., dressed in clean scrubs because she had learned years ago that appearance was the only armor available to people without power. Janet sat across from her at a conference table. 2 other people sat silent, Carol Duchamp from the investigation firm, and a man from hospital legal named Dennis who looked at Katie the way people look at documents they've already written off. "We've received concerning information about your employment history," Janet began, reading from a printed sheet. "Your application indicated 5 years of nursing experience prior to Mercy General, but our investigator has found irregularities in your credential verification. Additionally, we've received multiple reports of performance concerns during your employment here, charting errors, potential medication omissions, and operating outside the scope of practice for a registered nurse." Katie's hands were on the table. They were shaking. Not from fear. From the effort of not moving. From the discipline of not standing up and leaving, which would be admission. From the terrible muscle memory of following orders from people with more authority, even when those orders were wrong. "Those are false," Katie said. 8 words. Measured. Flat. "We're not making accusations," Dennis said smoothly. "We're investigating. We have a responsibility to our patients and our staff. Until this investigation concludes, we're placing you on immediate suspension with pay. You'll surrender your hospital badge. You're barred from the facility pending the outcome of the review." The badge came off her ID lanyard. It was made of plastic. It had taken her 2 years to earn, and it took 6 seconds to take away. Katie placed it on the table. Watched it sit there next to the printed lies about her. "How long?" she asked. "We'll expedite," Carol Duchamp said. 2 to 3 weeks, assuming no complications. Mercy General's employee handbook defined complications as information that required escalation. Dr. Hargrove had constructed his narrative carefully enough that there would be complications. There would be letters from Legacy Emanuel suggesting employment questions. There would be a military records request that would be denied as classified information, which itself would look suspicious. By the time the dust settled, Katie Morrison would be the nurse who had falsified her background, who had operated beyond her scope, who had, in the worst interpretation, endangered patients by pretending to expertise she didn't possess. The sergeant major tried to find her that afternoon. He went to her apartment address from Dylan's intake form. Knocked on a door where nobody answered. He tried calling Mercy General's main line and was told she was no longer available. He stood in Dylan's hospital room, watching his son's heart rate normalize on the monitor, and understood that the woman who had saved his child's life was already gone. Katie walked into the San Diego Veterans Affairs Medical Center at 1:22 p.m., 3 days after her suspension. The waiting room smelled like institutional coffee and the particular silence that only gathering places filled with traumatized people produce. Young Marines sat in the chairs. Some missing limbs. Some shaking with a kind of tremor that came from inside the nervous system, not from cold. One young man with a prosthetic leg and a face that had seen remedy around the same time Katie had seen it looked at her as she checked in. He recognized something in her bearing, that particular way she moved, economical, purposeful, every motion carrying weight. He nodded respect. Katie couldn't return it. She sat down and waited for her name to be called, surrounded by the people she had once saved, now part of the system she could no longer navigate. The intake counselor called her name at 2:15 p.m. Katie stood. Walked toward the door. Nearly kept walking right past it, out of the building, into the rain that had started hammering the San Diego streets like applause for her own failure. The VA hospital waiting room smelled like floor wax and broken promises. Katie sat 3 chairs away from a young Marine with a prosthetic leg, one empty chair between them like a moat. He didn't recognize her. None of them did. The kid with the eye patch, the corporal with tremors in both hands, the petty officer 3rd class who kept checking his phone like it might tell him why he couldn't sleep anymore, they'd all walked past her in field hospitals while she moved between the dying with hands steady as surgical steel. Now she was the patient. Now she was invisible. The clipboard felt heavy. Reason for visit, PTSD evaluation. Typed by someone who'd never heard a mortar round turn a shipping container into shrapnel. Katie's jaw clenched once, released. Control. That was all she had left. Her sister didn't know she was in San Diego. Her sister didn't know she'd walked away from 20 years of service, from the Navy Cross hanging in some VA office, from the commendations and the unit patches and the title that had made her somebody once. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. The woman who'd pulled the sergeant major from a burning Humvee in Ramadi. The woman who'd extracted 12 Marines under crossfire while rounds pinged off concrete and somebody's blood mixed with diesel exhaust and the sound of her own breathing inside a protective mask. Her sister thought she'd taken a nursing job in Oregon. Clean break from active duty, the email said. Needed to heal. Nobody needs to know why. 3 days after Dr. Hargrove's suspension order came down, 3 days of sitting in her apartment watching rain hammer the windows, Katie walked into this waiting room. Took her vitals. Waited 6 hours. The nurse, a woman maybe 2 years her junior, asked if she'd ever had thoughts of harming herself. Katie said no. That was technically true. It was harming everyone else she'd stopped being able to do. The clinic doctor never looked up from his computer. Wrote a prescription for sertraline. Suggested coping strategies in a voice that suggested he'd read them from a pamphlet 5 minutes before her appointment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sergeant major walking through those waiting room doors at 08 for 7 hours, wearing dress blues so crisp they looked laminated, Dylan's small hand gripping his left thumb like it was the only rope tethered to earth. The boy wore new shoes. His hair was combed. Neither of them noticed Katie sitting in the plastic chair because she was practicing the most important skill she'd ever learned, disappearing. The sergeant major had a leather folder clutched against his chest. A folder that moved with the gravity of documents that changed things. But Katie was already on her feet, already moving toward the exit, because she understood exactly what was happening and she couldn't watch it happen to her. The suspension, the investigation, the fabricated complaints in her file, it was real enough that it was over. Mercy General didn't want her. The sergeant major had figured it out, had dug into records, had probably spent 72 hours understanding why his son's savior had been erased from the building. He was going to fight. He was going to demand justice for the woman who drained fluid from a child's heart while his attending physician froze like a statue. She couldn't be there when it happened. Her hand was on the door when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't look. Almost kept walking. But muscle memory took over. Military protocol. Always check the call. Always confirm what's hunting you. The text was from the hospital's main line, board meeting emergency session. 10 a.m. All attending physicians and nursing supervisors. Attendance mandatory. Katie's chest didn't tighten. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Her body understood something her mind was still processing. The sergeant major wasn't just going to ask questions. He was going to bring every answer with him. She drove to Mercy General in rain that fell like machine gun fire on the windshield. The parking lot was half empty because it wasn't even 0930 yet. She parked at the far edge, where her car wouldn't be noticed, and took the back stairwell up to the administrative floors. Through a service corridor. Past the accounting office where she'd never been. The boardroom door had frosted glass, opaque enough that she could see shadows moving inside but not faces. She stood outside and listened. The sergeant major's voice when he began speaking sounded like a transmission breaking down, controlled, precise, barely contained. My name is Sergeant Major Thomas Morrison, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. I'm here about my son. And about someone who saved his life while she was being destroyed. The administrative voices, confused, defensive, that particular tone hospitals use when confronted with evidence they've made a mistake, started overlapping. But the sergeant major's voice cut through them like a blade. My son hasn't spoken a single word in 18 months. Not to therapists. Not to doctors. Not to me. Until 3 days ago, when he was visited by the woman you just suspended without cause. Through the frosted glass, Katie saw a figure stand. The sergeant major, she knew without seeing. The way he positioned himself, anchored, immovable. He said one thing. One sentence. He said, Chief Morrison. The shadows stopped moving. I want to know why you suspended the senior chief who saved his life. And I want to know it right now. The board chairman, a man whose voice Katie recognized from hospital announcements, started something about protocol and investigations and allegations. But the sergeant major wasn't listening anymore. The leather folder opened. Papers spread across the mahogany table with the sound of impact. Her personnel file. Real one. Not the version fabricated in your system. Naval records. Service citations. Combat history. This woman extracted 12 wounded Marines from active enemy fire in Ramadi while a convoy burned around her. She held a tourniquet on a teenager's femoral artery for 47 minutes, nearly an hour, while waiting for extraction. She earned a Navy Cross for that action. A Navy Cross, and you suspended her because a mediocre doctor didn't want her questioning his medical judgment. One of the board members, the CEO, maybe, made a sound like he'd swallowed something sharp. Look at the man she saved. The sergeant major's voice dropped into the register that made people listen or die. It was not a request. It was a command. Look at me. Through the frosted glass, Katie saw him point. Saw the shadows lean forward. She pulled me out of a Humvee burning in Jolan district. I was 23 years old and she was the first person to save my life. 38 minutes ago, my son spoke his first words in a year and a half because she was in his room. Spoke her call sign. Chief Morrison. Do you understand what that means? Silence. The kind that breaks things. It means she's his anchor. He's tethered to the world. And you tried to erase her because a doctor who couldn't diagnose a pericardial effusion got his feelings hurt. The door opened. The sergeant major stood in the threshold, Dylan clutching his hand, the boy's eyes fixed on the frosted glass as if he could see through it. As if he was looking for her. He was. Admiral Patricia Vance stood next from inside the boardroom. The retina around the room seemed to shift. Even filtered through frosted glass and distance, Katie recognized the posture of someone who'd spent 40 years making people obey without raising her voice. "I'm going to read her decorations," Admiral Vance said. Her command voice, the kind that had directed carrier operations and amphibious assaults. "You're going to listen. And you're going to understand exactly how badly you've misjudged this situation. Bronze Star with Valor, for leadership under fire." The phrase hung. Absorbed. Transformed into something that tasted like metal. Purple Heart. 2 of them. That's shrapnel wounds and blood and not enough anesthesia during field surgery. Another pause. Another beat. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. For coordinating evacuation protocols across 3 forward operating bases. The room was smaller now. Everything compressed into that moment. And a Navy Cross. The 3rd highest combat decoration available to enlisted personnel. Given for extraordinary heroism in direct conflict with the enemy. Through the glass, Katie saw Dr. Hargrove. Saw him push his chair back like the surface was burning. "I'm retired now," Admiral Vance continued, and her voice had the texture of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth without apology. "But I serve on this board. And I'm going to recommend we figure out who in your administration decided to destroy one of the most decorated sailors you've ever employed because a surgeon wanted to protect his ego." The door opened wider. The sergeant major stepped fully into the corridor, still holding Dylan's hand, the boy's eyes moving along the walls as if searching. Katie pressed herself against the service corridor entrance, invisible again, perfecting a skill she'd developed in field hospitals, how to save people while nobody noticed. That's when Dylan's head turned. That's when his eyes found her. His mouth opened. For 18 months, 548 days, nothing had come out. His neurologist said selective mutism. His therapist said trauma. His father said his son was drowning and no one could throw him a rope. "Chief Morrison," Dylan whispered. The boy's voice wasn't loud. Wasn't dramatic. Was barely a breath pushed through vocal cords that hadn't used them since the day an IED turned a base housing unit into rubble and took his mother with it. But it moved through the hallway like a defibrillator paddle. Like something electrical that reset the world. The sergeant major's head turned. "Found her." Katie saw his face move through a progression, confusion, recognition, understanding, then something deeper. The way a man looks when he realizes the person he's been searching for was standing in plain sight the entire time. "You," he said. Not a question. Katie didn't move. Didn't flee. Didn't respond with anything except her eyes, which were now reading something in his expression that said he'd already understood everything. The withdrawn nurse who couldn't meet anyone's gaze. The woman who flinched at sirens. The person who'd shown up at Mercy General in borrowed humility and used a pericardiocentesis needle like a surgical artist. He'd known. Somewhere in the space between watching her drain fluid from his son's failing heart and investigating a woman they were trying to destroy, he'd known exactly what she was. "Admiral," the sergeant major called back into the boardroom, not breaking eye contact with Katie. "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. The woman in your files. The one you suspended." Katie's hands were shaking. Not fear. Restraint. The trembling of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to hold things together and was now watching all the careful architecture collapse. "I need to show you something," Admiral Vance said. Her voice had moved into the corridor now. Katie heard footsteps. Heard the scrape of shoes on tile that meant power was redistributing itself. "I just got a call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Through the boardroom doorway, Katie saw Dr. Hargrove's face drain white. Saw him reach for something, or the table, a chair, the last thread of control. "They've been tracking electronic access to federal military personnel databases for the past 5 days," Admiral Vance continued, and her pace was unhurried because she didn't need to rush. Victory waited for her. Someone with hospital credentials accessed Katie's service records. Someone altered them. Inserted a false dishonorable discharge. created fabricated disciplinary actions, falsified federal documents. The silence was complete now. Even the building seemed to stop breathing. They tracked every keystroke, every timestamp, every change. Admiral Vance emerged from the boardroom, 2 FBI agents following, both carrying folders that looked very thin and very heavy. Dr. Robert Hargrove. Your fingerprints are all over the hospital system logs. Digital forensics has them marked and indexed and admissible in federal court. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth. Katie heard him try. This is absurd, I never. You also impersonated a federal official, one of the agents said. She wore her badge on a chain around her neck like a talisman. Called Katie's former commanding officer claiming to represent the VA Inspector General's office. Attempted to corroborate a false record. The handcuffs didn't look dramatic. Were just metal, functional, exactly what they'd been designed to be, restraint. Dr. Hargrove didn't resist when they were applied. Didn't resist when they escorted him past the board members who were now studying their hands with intense focus. Didn't resist when they walked him past the hospital staff who'd begun gathering in the hallway, the same people who'd watched him humiliate the floor nurse, mock her deference, make a bet she'd quit. He didn't resist when he saw her standing there. His eyes moved across her face like he was trying to read something that had been written in a language he'd never learned. Katie's composure was perfect. Her expression was blank as surgical steel. She wasn't the woman who'd flinched at his voice or accepted his dismissal or knelt to clean up the lunch tray he'd destroyed. That person was something he'd created by accident, a mask she'd built to survive. And now he was watching it come off. The perp walk made the evening news. Katie didn't watch it. She sat in the hospital lobby while Admiral Vance and the Sergeant Major and Dylan filled out paperwork, while the hospital CEO reviewed the fabricated performance complaints now visible in digital forensics reports, while the liability nightmares stacked themselves into piles that would take years to manage. The CEO's face had gone the color of old hospital walls. The hospital's legal team was already calculating damages. In the boardroom, which Katie could see through the open doors now that the glass was no longer an obstacle, the motion came to a vote, full reinstatement of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, with back pay, formal apology, and a recommendation for the creation of a new position, Clinical Director of Pediatric Trauma. The vote was unanimous. But Katie sat silent, Dylan holding her hand now. He'd moved closer when the agents took Dr. Hargrove away, had positioned himself between her and the rest of the world, tears streaming down her face she didn't bother to wipe. Not the tears of someone defeated. The tears of someone who'd carried so much weight for so long that acknowledging she no longer had to carry it alone broke something open that had been sealed since Ramadi. The Sergeant Major sat down beside her. Didn't speak. Just sat there, this man whose life she'd saved 20 years ago, whose son she'd saved 3 weeks ago, understanding something about the spaces between heroism and survival that most people never learned. "Will you help my son?" he asked quietly. Katie looked at Dylan. Looked at her hands, the ones that drained pericardial fluid, that held tourniquet pressure, that shook too hard to hold coffee but stayed steady enough to do what needed doing. She nodded once. "Yes, sir," she said. 2 years dissolved like medicine in water. Katie worked at Mercy General as the Clinical Director of Pediatric Trauma, a position created for her, funded by a grant Admiral Vance had secured through veteran advocacy networks. The job existed because someone had finally decided that the people who'd seen the worst deserved the resources to give the most. Dylan, now 8 years old, sat beside her at a Padres game in downtown San Diego, chattering about baseball statistics she didn't understand while eating a hot dog with the concentrated attention of a child who'd learned that ordinary moments were worth savoring. He was completely unaware he was sitting next to the woman who'd saved his life twice, once by draining the fluid compressing his heart, once by refusing to disappear when the world told her she wasn't wanted. The Sergeant Major texted her a photo. She almost didn't open it. Almost kept scrolling through her email. But she did. The image showed Dr. Hargrove in a strip mall community college somewhere in Nevada, teaching CPR to minimum wage workers and part-time nursing assistants, his medical license permanently revoked, a federal conviction on his record, teaching people the most basic life-saving techniques because it was the only work that would have him. Katie deleted the photo without responding. In the Mercy General main lobby, her old combat boots were bronzed and mounted in a display case with a plaque, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, USN, Ret, when others would not. Below it, a smaller inscription, saved 12 Marines in Ramadi. Saved countless more at home. She walked past it every shift now, didn't stop to look anymore. The woman who'd worn those boots was still there, somewhere in her muscle memory, but she wasn't a ghost hiding in the corner anymore. She was integrated into the person she'd become. Dylan ran ahead to meet his father for pickup, turned and waved. Katie waved back, her hand steady, no tremor, no hesitation. The closing shot shows her at the nurse's station the next morning, teaching a young resident the same lesson she'd learned in field hospitals where people died because of decisions made by people who'd never seen combat. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. That's where the real victory lies, not in military decorations or formal apologies, but in the quiet work of healing people who thought they could never be healed. She still keeps the VA hospital appointment card in her locker. Still goes every week. But she's not invisible anymore. If you've made it this far, you already know that the quiet people deserve to be heard. Subscribe for more stories about the warriors you walk past every single day. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in Katie's position? Was Dr. Hargrove's punishment enough? And hit that notification bell, because sometimes the people who save the most live the quietest lives.